Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. So the debate is over, and the debate about the debate began immediately afterwards. Armed with only a pen, a pad of paper, a bottle of water, and their wits, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump came face to face for the first time in their lives last night on stage in Philadelphia. The vice president and the former president were prepared to do battle before an audience numbering tens of millions on TV and online across the US. But of course, the candidates had been preparing for this day for weeks. They've been working with a close-knit team of policy advisors and debating coaches. In this episode, we'll get an insight into what was happening behind closed doors in the run-up to this key moment in the election campaign. We'll also look back at some of the zingers and gaffes which became make-or-break moments during previous presidential debates. And we'll bring together Democratic and Republican leaders in a lively debate on the state of the race with just 8 weeks until polling day.
I think this debate might be one of the most consequential presidential debates that we've had in our history.
Brett O'Donnell is known to many as America's best debate coach. His clients included George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Ron DeSantis. And he was twice named as being among the 5 most influential people not running for president. So he's the perfect guest to provide us with a look behind the curtain at the dark arts of election debates. Well, Brett O'Donnell, thank you very much for joining me. And I guess I should start by asking, from your experience and what you know about these two candidates, what do you think they've been doing to prepare for the debate?
Well, what we think we know are two different things, because candidates are usually pretty secretive about their debate prep, as they should be. But what we do know is that Kamala Harris has been hid away for about a week in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, doing debate prep, using a live stand-in for Donald Trump and doing mock debates. What we know, or we think we know about Donald Trump, is he has been reviewing policy with his advisors, talking through strategy, and he's been doing a ton of interviews. And I think he's using these interviews to try out lines of argument, to get himself ready and used to the bright lights of these big debates.
We have heard reports of a large man dressed like Donald Trump who was spotted near the site where Kamala Harris was preparing. Now, how far do coaches go to impersonate their clients' opponents?
Well, it depends upon the candidate and what they want. When we do debate prep like that, we have folks that will play the other candidate in the race, but we don't usually have them dress exactly like the other candidate or try to appear like the other candidate. We want them to sound like the other candidate, to make sure that our candidate is ready for the arguments that they will hear in the debate, and that practice debate is harder than the debate they'll actually do when they do the real thing.
Is it to some degree like rehearsing for a stage play or a movie? Do they have to become essentially like method actors?
Well, I don't think it's method acting, but it is based on performance. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. It's not just a recitation of facts, and it's not really a debate. These debates are more about message and moments, and those moments are the thing which pick up the press fascination, like the Ronald Reagan age moment, or the George Bush moment when he looks off Al Gore in the debate, or different moments like that are recorded in history of the standout moments from presidential debates. And so you do go through those, you rehearse them, and how you perform them matters, because folks take meaning away from not just what you say, but how you say it. And so smiling and making yourself open, an open communicator, doing things that cast yourself as likable, telling stories, connecting with the audience. All of those are things that are part of the overall performance that you have to perfect in order to do well in these political debates.
That's actually really interesting. And I wonder, in that case, how intense it gets. I mean, do the candidates during these rehearsals get peppered with insults and challenged very heavily in order to try to put them off their stride?
Absolutely. I've had presidential candidates get angry in practice mock debates and actually leave the room or end prep or get angry at the person who's the stand-in because they become so believable. You want those simulations to be just like the real thing. You don't want it to be something that's over the top or not realistic. You want those candidates to face what they're going to face when they step out on that stage.
Hopefully they don't take it out on you afterwards if it's that intense.
Right? The objective is to have them the most ready so that when they walk off of that stage, they say, that was way easier than prep.
What do you teach them about when it's best to attack and when it's best to defend?
Well, first of all, I think a candidate should always be on offense. But what I mean by offense is not necessarily attacking your opponent, but on your message, whether it's the affirmative message that you're pushing or the message that you want to push on another candidate. Because if you slip into defensive mode, that lets the other candidate get on offense and gain the upper foot. These things are all judged by the public based on who is the most aggressive without being offensive. And so if you remember back to the very first Obama-Romney debate, Romney won that debate because he was on offense all the time on the economy, and it had Obama on his back foot. So you want your candidate to be leaning into the debate on message, on offense, either on their own message or on the message we're trying to push on the other candidate.
Brett, I wonder, are there any candidates that are effectively uncoachable or perhaps unwilling to be coached?
There are some. I've had a few who don't respond well to debate prep. They're know-it-alls. They think they understand how to do this better. And the best candidates I work with are the ones that are smart, they're coachable, they give input into the debate prep process. We don't try to change people into the worst thing you can do is make a candidate inauthentic, to make them into something or someone they're not. And so we don't want to do that, but we want that candidate to be as sharp as possible. And we've got experience. My firm has coached over 100 candidates in political debates, whether they're House debates, Senate debates, or presidential debates. We've done 6 presidential debates, 2 prime ministers in Britain. And so we kind of understand how these things work. And so we think we're really good at giving a candidate a strategy. The candidate has input in that strategy, and then we go practice it, and they make it their own.
As a Brit myself, I can't help but ask, how different did you find the British candidates compared with the US ones?
Every candidate is different, whether they're British, American, and we've worked in other countries as well. Every single candidate is different, and you adapt the prep process to that particular candidate. It's a matter of some liking some, working with some over others. We worked with both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, and I found them both amazing people, very intelligent and great to work with.
Is it more important as a candidate in a debate to have more appeal in terms of personality and be likable as a person, or is the political competence a more important factor?
They're both very important. Voters vote for candidates for 3 reasons. One is they think they can do the job. It's a job interview. They can be president of the United States. They can make the tough decisions. They've got good policy plans. But the second and third reasons relate to that likability factor. Folks want to know that you're in this for them, that you have their best interest in mind, and then they want to like you. And we tend to vote for candidates that we like, that we think are doing this for us, and that we think can do the job. And, there's instances all through American presidential political history that bear this out. The public thought by a large margin that Mitt Romney would be better on the economy, but they liked Barack Obama better, and they ended up voting for him because they thought he was in it for them, and they liked him. And so they decided to go with someone that they thought was a little less competent on the economy, but that they'd like better.
You indicated each candidate is different, and I wonder how much you have to adapt your coaching methods to suit the skills, the weaknesses, the strengths of each particular candidate.
You have to adapt them all the time. Some candidates need work on the public speaking side. They need work on the argument side. Some candidates are very talented speakers and need help on the strategic side and how to formulate arguments or how to think about the strategy. And then you have some candidates who come in who have a great strategy and they just don't know how to execute it. So it's really a matter of what makes them comfortable, what makes them feel best prepared. John McCain was a talented speaker, very smart strategically, and just needed some help on execution and giving him some good lines to capture what he was trying to argue. And so we didn't do a lot of mock debates with Senator McCain. We did a lot more sitting around, talking through answers, talking about strategy than we did in mock debates. But then on the other hand, I've worked with candidates who like a lot of mock debates. They want to go through the practice. They want things to be and look exactly as they will on debate day. So it's a matter of what's best for that candidate.
Brett, I'm sure you'll agree, the presidential race, the election campaign is more of a marathon than a sprint, more like a steeplechase with barriers to overcome. And I wonder, when it comes down to it, within that timeline, within that longer timeline, how important a moment is the actual presidential debate for the candidates and for the audiences watching at home?
It's a great question. Normally, presidential debates are a part of the overall campaign narrative. And there are other things that are as important, whether it's the convention speech or the announcement speech or things like that. But in this particular instance, where Kamala Harris has only been a candidate for 50 days, has done only one major interview, has been off the campaign trail as much as she's been on the campaign trail, and we know very little about her, and that this will be the only debate they do, I think this debate might be one of the most consequential presidential debates that we've had in our history.
It's interesting you say that because I guess up to now, Donald Trump would have been preparing pretty much solely to talk and debate against Joe Biden. And now, of course, this new candidate has come up quite last minute and probably thrown quite a bit of a spanner in the works in his coaching sessions.
Sure, absolutely. When you change candidates toward the end of a race, you've prepared toward working toward being ready for that candidate. I mean, in every presidential campaign, you usually know who the candidate's going to be 8 or 9 months before the election. And so you're gearing up, preparing everything toward that specific candidate. But Joe Biden fulfilled what was the worst principle of political debates, which is you can't win an election, but you can lose it. He lost his election and ended his candidacy in a debate. And so now Donald Trump is facing a different candidate. That also prevents challenges for Kamala Harris because she's little known. In the poll yesterday, 28% of all Americans say they need to know more about her before they can even consider voting for her, whereas that number for Donald Trump is below 10% at 8%. So I think there are challenges for both people going into this debate.
Brett, I'm sure you agree that to someone who watches elections so closely, you probably agree that Donald Trump is the kind of person who holds back no punches, which is a lot of the appeal for his particular supporters. I wonder what you expect coming out of a debate against someone like Kamala Harris, because last time against Joe Biden, Donald Trump came across far more presidential by holding back.
Yeah, and I think he's got to do that again. I think if he focuses on policy and makes this election a referendum on her administration, the Biden-Harris administration, and casts her policies as a weak, failed, dangerously liberal candidate, then he's on the right trail. If this becomes a sort of personality fest, personal attack debate, then that disadvantages him and it advantages Kamala Harris.
Brett, would you expect the two to debate once again before the final polling day?
I don't, actually. I think this will be the only presidential debate that we will have unless one of the candidates has a major stumble and slides back in the polls 4, 5, 6 points, then they'll be clamoring for another debate. But my guess is this is going to be a razor-tight election, and that this debate will be consequential in giving momentum to one of the candidates, but I don't think it will give tremendous separation. It just may give them enough momentum to win the election.
Brett O'Donnell, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Great to speak with you.
Now we're going to bring you a debate of our own, and I'm delighted to be joined by a pair of leading political personalities with very different perspectives on the state of the presidential race. Amy Dacey was chosen by President Barack Obama to be his CEO of the Democratic National Committee, while Josh McCoon is chairman of the Republican Party in the important battleground state of Georgia. Amy Dacey and Josh McCoon, very glad to have you both on the show. I'm going to start with a question for both of you. Amy, perhaps putting it to you first. Compared with elections in recent times, how significant is the upcoming US presidential election for both the US and the global environment?
Well, we certainly have a habit of saying this is always the most important election of our lifetime. And I think this certainly has a lot at stake. I mean, I do believe that there's decisions that will be made within the next 4 years, things that will be happening in the U.S. and globally that matter a lot. And I think that is why you see, in this election environment, not only for the presidential, but we also have, in our federal government, Senate races and House races that will determine the position of power in those two chambers as well.
And Josh, do you see it the same way?
It's an incredibly important election. So many things have happened over the course of the last couple of years that are just unprecedented. The tactics of weaponizing the criminal justice system against political opponents in this country, depending on how this election turns out, that strategy is either going to be validated and something we're going to live with, I think, for the rest of our lives, or it's something we're going to turn away from. So I think this election is incredibly consequential for the future of American democracy.
Traditionally, the candidates would always espouse their policies in the campaigns. It seems very different nowadays. And I wonder, when the polls are indicating a very tight race, how important is a dominant performance at the presidential debate? I mean, who needs it the most? Amy, who do you think?
Well, I think it's important. It's certainly one of the tools in the toolbox of candidates to reach voters. I think there's been so much heightened energy around debates, especially after the debate between former President Trump and President Biden. But I do think it is that rare moment when both opponents are on stage at the same time, pushed to talk about their differences, their policies, what they will bring to the table. So, I do think that we'll see probably even a larger viewership than maybe even we have in the last one. But also the change now as well is you don't have to necessarily just watch the debate on debate night. There will be clips running all the next day. There will be analysis. So what happens between these two individuals on the debate stage will matter in setting the tone. Campaigns are about contrasts, and debates are the best way to kind of show that and showcase that.
But Josh, is it the policies or the personalities that people remember the most from debates when it comes to casting their vote?
Yeah, I think it's both. President Trump put out, I served on the platform committee at the Republican National Convention, and he came out with 20 explicit promises to the American people if he's elected. Things like no taxes on tips for service workers, no taxes on Social Security earnings. So President Trump has a very clear agenda for the next 4 years. Kamala Harris, it seems to change by the day. Her website still doesn't have any policy documents or white papers on it. But I think there's going to be a very significant contrast between the candidates there.
Now, Amy, of course, there is still the big issue of the fact that these are personalities, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, is it the policies or the personalities that will make the difference?
Well, I don't think that, this Republican candidate is about policies at all or progress. He's about popularity. I'd have to disagree with my fellow panelist. It's been very clear what the policies are going forward, with this Harris Walz ticket. I think he should refresh his search engine, because they've made it very clear on their website, laying out what they're doing. This is a campaign that, as of 2 months ago, didn't know, the Harris didn't have the role of presidential candidate, but they've gone a long way. They've certainly made it much clearer, I think, at our convention, in the Democrats in Chicago about what that is. If you put that convention speech up against President Trump's, it's strikingly different. I think they've made it very clear what the vision is. I think they've also made it very clear the tone and tenor that they want to have moving forward and what's at stake. But I think they've also done it in an optimistic way, not talking just about what they're against. I think there's a very striking difference between these two candidates as far as personality. I think that's something that people do take into account. But I also think that, if President Trump decides to even talk about policy tomorrow night, it'll be interesting. It's not been what he's usually tended to do in these forums. But I do think it's what's driving this conversation. I think the Harris and Walz team have made it very clear what they stand for and what they're working on. They also are willing to talk about that Biden-Harris administration and the accomplishments that you've seen. President Trump was president for 4 years, and he doesn't really talk much about, what happened during those 4 years and what the vision is for the next 4.
I'll get into details in some of those things in a moment, but clearly President Biden's poor performance in his debate with former President Trump was a pivotal moment in this year's election race. But we've also seen other moments which seemed at the time that they might prove to be game changers. Donald Trump's defiant response to the assassination attempt was considered by many to have sealed his victory, but then his boost in the polls faded. And the jubilant scenes at the DNC after Kamala Harris's nomination led to an upsurge in confidence and mood, but it also failed to create a significant bounce in the polls. Is there a danger that we in the media, but also the politicians, get swept up in moments like these and this latest debate and the over impact they might have on the voters, Josh?
Well, I think that's right. There's such an obsession with the horse race component of any campaign. I think it's everyone's always looking for that pivotal moment. The American electorate is largely divided with a small segment of voters that are going to decide this election. And what's very clear is that those voters are looking for a change. The idea that Vice President Harris wouldn't have any policy ideas because she wasn't the presidential nominee when she's been vice president for 3.5 years is a little bit difficult to swallow. This is a person who owns the last 3.5 years, the crushing inflation, the total abandonment of any pretense of protecting the southern border or our ports of entry, and of course a world that is on fire. This vice president has sat with President Biden every week. She bragged about being the last person in the room when a lot of these decisions were made, like the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. People are tired of this. I go around the state quite a bit talking to Republicans, independents, and folks are ready for a change, and they're looking for the 4 years they had under President Donald Trump, where we had an economy that worked for everyone, where we had the lowest recorded level of illegal immigration ever recorded in American history, and a world that was at relative peace and prosperity for all. So I think that is what this election boils down to. A small segment of folks that are looking for who is the change candidate. And the change candidate is not the person that has been sitting at the table making the decisions of the last 3.5 years.
Amy, I want to get your perspective on this, on how perhaps, it is easy to get swept up in the debate issue and the impact it might have on voters as well.
Well, I think anybody who's a political operative for years realizes that this is something that we eat, sleep, and breathe, every day. And the American people, are concerned about those issues that matter to them most in their family every day. And so sometimes these monumental moments in elections are not what they, are focused on. But once the conventions were over, this is the general election, series during the campaign, and people are paying attention and people are gearing up. I think you saw a tremendous monumental jump in momentum, certainly after the Democratic convention. I think you saw that with money, unprecedented amounts of money raised from new donors who hadn't given to the campaign before. I think you saw a huge number of volunteers that came to the campaign as well. And I will say that they are looking for something. They're looking for something that for people who share their values. I mean, to say change is going back to 4 years that were chaos under a global pandemic where there was mismanagement with the leadership, certainly at the top, at the presidential level. You're also looking at somebody who likes to divide the country rather than bring it together with his divisive language and how he's handled things. So I don't think people are looking for that. I think you really see see them looking forward to this, hope change moment, seeing about what's possible going forward, and really focused on the issues that matter to them. Okay. I do think these moments, polls are only a snapshot in time. These things, happen, and we gauge them to see how people are doing. But I think you've seen, progression. Voters are voting in the next couple of weeks here in the United States. So I think these moments are important because people will be deciding very soon who they want to support. But I think for all the races up and down the ballot, it'll make a lot. There will be a lot of things that happen in the next few weeks that will matter as there, people still have an opportunity to register to vote in this country. There's a lot of energy and effort being put into voter contact and reaching these individuals in each individual state. So I think this is the season, the election campaign where all those things are happening. So it will be a heightened interest from the electorate.
Well, here's one really for both of you. I'm going to start with Josh on this one now. With so many swing states in play, which is the best route to the White House for either of the candidates?
Well, one of the advantages President Trump enjoys is he does have multiple paths to the White House. I think most of those do run through Georgia, but we're optimistic the president's going to win here. We've worked very hard. We think we're in a good position. Vice President Harris really needs to run the table of the so-called blue wall states. She's going to need to win in Michigan. She's going to need to win in Wisconsin. She's going to need to win in Pennsylvania. And so she's got to win more of these so-called swing states than President Trump. And again, if you look at the recent polling, if you look at the forecasts from Nate Silver and others who have been at this a long time, they are looking at a situation where President Trump has the advantage. Of course, a lot of people think about the popular vote, but your viewers may not, be aware. These are 51 separate elections for presidential electors, and so the fact that Kamala Harris is going to win California and New York by significant margins doesn't really matter in the scope of things. You have to win the states that get you to 270, and I think President Trump has a decided advantage in terms of the number of pathways as well as the structural advantages he has in the states he needs to win.
Josh, I'm going to get back to Georgia in just a moment, but I want to get Amy's perspective on perhaps the best path for Kamala Harris to get to the White House.
Well, we have these traditional battleground states, the ones that Biden certainly won, in 2020. Those are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And those are the areas that, they'll be focused on, as well as, other states. I think that the bottom line is, the Trump campaign talked about in June and July that they were expanding, into states where they thought they can win. That is just not the case. And so it will be down to these states. I think if you follow the money where, money's being spent, I know the DNC just did another, infusion of cash into some of these battleground states and in down ballot races in these states. And then also where candidates are spending their time. That's the best indicator to see where they, have the best path to get through. But I think it's still those states. I think that's where they're investing, the Harris-Walz ticket is investing time, energy, and money. And then they will have a slew of surrogates that are out there as well. They also have some strong elected leaders in those states that serve as incredible surrogates that are doing, what they can in those states to try and gather support and momentum as well.
Josh, you indicated how important Georgia is. It looks like being one of those knife-edge states with voters split down the middle in recent polls. Now, the state's Republican governor, Brian Kemp, is well liked within the party. What do both of you think when you hear Donald Trump insulting him and his family? I mean, is it just a storm in a teacup, or could it cost the Republicans the election?
Yeah, I think a storm in a teacup, something that the media and the Democrats were really hoping would turn into some sort of opening for them. And the door's really been slammed shut on that. Governor Kemp has made it clear from the beginning that he supports the Republican ticket. He supports President Trump. He's appeared at fundraisers in support of the Trump campaign just within the last week or so. And of course, President Trump has had very kind things to say about Governor Kemp following his appearance on Sean Hannity's program. So, we're seeing a unified Republican Party here in Georgia. We're seeing a candidate who enjoys enormous leads in polling on questions of who leads better on the economy, who leads better on immigration. And of course, the Lake and Riley tragedy here in Georgia has brought immigration to the fore. We have some other structural things happening. We have 3 additional candidates who have qualified for the presidential ballot here: Jill Stein, Cornel West, and Claudia De La Cruz. In a typical Georgia presidential election, there's a libertarian, so there's a place for Republican protest votes to go. There's no similar opportunity on the Democratic side. That will not be the case this time. There'll be an equalized playing field with regard to that. So, I feel optimistic. We got a lot of work to do over the next 2 months. But if we turn out our voters, I believe we're going to win and win with a margin.
Now, Amy, on the other hand, Mr. Trump has also praised Georgia election officials by name at his rallies. Now, these are people who, under a new state law, could decide when and whether to certify the election result. How justified are Democrats to worry that the former president is laying down the ground for challenging any negative results for the GOP?
He should be very worried. He doesn't have any respect for the process in a lot of these states, and we saw what happened after the 2020 election. I think there are concerns. Anybody who can, in one breath, praise somebody and the next tear them down. This goes to the character, certainly, of the former president. I don't think he respects the process at all, and I just feel like that he's about winning this election, and if he doesn't, he will try to justify it in any way to try and dismantle decisions that are made by voters across the country.
Well, Josh, I want to get your perspective on that same issue.
Well, if we want to talk about dismantling the process, Democrats pushed aside their nominee who got 14 million votes in primaries for someone who didn't win a single presidential primary. Here in Georgia, they've actually gone to federal court to try to prevent voters from having additional choices on the ballot. So Democrats are happy to be guardians of democracy as long as they can control who your choices are through non-democratic means. And, I think President Trump has demonstrated throughout this campaign a commitment to a vision for the future that is optimistic, that is bright, that is a welcome relief for American families that are paying $28,000 more a year for basic necessities because of the inflationary policies of Vice President Harris. So, I see a situation here in Georgia where we have a state elections board that respects the process. We have a state elections board that has adopted common sense rules about observing what happens when people go to the polls, making sure the number of voters agrees with the number of votes cast in a precinct. And actually, the rule adopted regarding certification doesn't invite the opportunity to delay certification. What it does is it empowers local elections officials to ask questions before they vote to certify an election. Because if we are not going to give them any opportunity to exercise independent judgment, there's really no point in the local certification process at all. So these are common sense changes that if people actually had the opportunity to vote on a ballot for these, would probably get 90% of the vote, because no one really objects to more eyes on the process, transparency in the process, and the ability for the folks that have been vested with the oversight of our elections to actually exercise that oversight.
Now, on another note, there was a lot of eager anticipation to know who the vice presidential picks would be. And one for both of you, and I'll start with Amy on this. How do you assess the impact and performance of those vice presidential picks so far?
Well, I do think that, people vote for the presidential candidate. I think that necessarily the vice presidential pick doesn't determine what the election's going to be. But I think a lot of times what the vice presidential nominee should do is complement, the leader, show that, that they bring strengths to the table, a wealth of experience. And I think that you see that definitely in the Harris-Walz ticket. You see somebody who's been a public servant for a long time, certainly, has been a teacher, a coach, as somebody who's, served this country, in military. Like, I do think you see somebody who has been involved both in Congress and both as an executive and a governorship. So he brings a wealth of experience to the ticket. And I think that he's been, you see that synergy with them out on the road and what he's doing. I think, definitely, I think Trump picked his, nominee in J.D. Vance for those probably same reasons, to compliment him. I don't think that some of the remarks that he's made thus far have been really embraced, by the rest of the country. I do think you can argue about where he can go and where, he can campaign in. But I think both of these tickets, will be out there trying to gather support. But I just see the Harris-Walz one as a very strong and significant decision that could help benefit that ticket.
Josh, getting your perspective on this too, I also want to ask you about comments that have been out in the media about former President Trump saying he would hold accountable those who he feels haven't really held up to what he expects from them during this campaigning period. I mean, he's kind of threatening people on that. What's your take on that too?
So I guess I'll start with the question about the vice presidential candidates. Senator Vance, we had him here in Georgia about a year ago. Just a dynamic speaker, a quintessential American story, someone who grew up in difficult circumstances, which he obviously wrote about, a movie was made about, and was able to overcome those circumstances and really live out the American dream. And for people for whom that American dream seems further out of reach, 3.5 years on in this administration, that's a really compelling speaker to have out on the campaign trail. And obviously, he does a great job staying on message. If you listen to his interviews on television, he's doing a great job for us there. I think the pick of Governor Walz on the Democratic side just tells you a little bit more about the divide in the party over Israel and issues of anti-Semitism in this country. Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania was the obvious choice for Vice President Harris to make, but for her concerns of losing some support in Michigan and perhaps some other areas around the country. That's very worrying for those of us that believe strongly in the idea there needs to be a bipartisan consensus in our country in supporting the state of Israel. But your question regarding President Trump and what he's had to say, look, I said this at the beginning of the interview. We have had an unprecedented perversion of our criminal justice system. Here in Georgia, we have 3 presidential electors who are under indictment for going to a meeting to cast contingent electoral votes consistent with precedent in this country going back to 1960. And they've lost 3.5 years of their lives to ambitious prosecutor who doesn't really care about enforcing Georgia laws, but wants to go after her political opponents. Of course, people that have been guilty of perverting our criminal justice system for political purposes ought to be held accountable. I think most people agree with that. I don't think it's about revenge or anything else. It's about what I said earlier, which is what separates the United States of America and other countries with robust democratic conditions from countries that we all agree don't have those, is that we do have an independent criminal justice system that calls balls and strikes, that where you don't get a different result when you go to court depending on which political party you belong to. And that's something I've lived with here in Georgia for the last 3.5 years. I watched our 16 electors, volunteers, people that didn't get paid a dime, who participated in a 26-minute meeting, be persecuted all over the state. An 80-year-old grandmother who had Fulton County DA investigators come to her home and interrogate her. It's disturbing. It's not anything that I thought I would ever see happen in this country, the freest country in the world. So I think when President Trump speaks about that, it's important. And unfortunately, so much of the other side of the story just has never been told because the people in a position to tell the story want to tell a very skewed version of what went on over the last 3.5 years in some of these so-called criminal investigations.
Amy, what's your perspective on this?
So I don't think that there's any place that you would say that that Vice President Harris doesn't take these things seriously, that there was a lot that happened after the 2020 election where people were persecuted for doing their job and definitely administering the election in the way that they were supposed to. I think that we have to come together and not, debate whether or not this election, going forward, we've got too much at stake to not come together around this. Should be an area that Democrats and Republicans are in agreement about, making sure that people know that they have the opportunity to vote, that they have more access to vote rather than restricting it. And then they also can feel confident that the administering of the elections going forward, and that people accept the terms of the election and what happened. And that's too important. And I just hope everybody rallies around that and is able to do that at the end of this election season. One
of my recent guests, Professor Alan Lichtman, is famous for successfully predicting presidential election results using his 13 keys method. Now, in the past, he predicted a Donald Trump victory when the polls suggested Hillary Clinton would win. This year, he's predicting a Kamala Harris victory. Whereas polls have often proved unreliable, he's never been wrong, essentially. So I wonder, Amy, should party leaders pay attention to what Professor Lichtman says?
I think party leaders should pay attention to the voters and on the ground and what they're doing. I have the utmost respect for him, and it's been certainly interesting how he's evaluated this and moved this forward over the years. But I think their focus right now is on delivering, a message in these districts that resonates with voters. It's also like taking care and focus on the Senate and the House races and the down ballot races that are happening, but having that direct conversation with voters. I think whereas polls are an indication in time, certainly the historical nature of his decision making, can be seen as something that has certainly been successful in the past. But I think anybody who's in these campaigns right now, anybody who's trying to find a winning combination for the election has to really focus on what the voters are saying and what they need to talk to them about.
Well, Josh, considering Professor Lichtman's track record, does it worry you at all that he sees a Kamala Harris victory?
No, it doesn't. I think it's great that we're finding an area of agreement between both of us on this. It's maybe an interesting thing for pundits to talk about, but as Amy said, this is about, making your case to voters, making your case to that relatively small population of voters in about 30 or 40 counties around this country that are going to decide this election. And that goes back to that messaging. I will say that I don't know that the professor accounted for the unprecedented nature of the 2024 election process, where you went from having one nominee of a major party to another nominee of a major party. I might take issue with how he graded some of his keys this go around. But you know what? We'll all find out on November 5th or very shortly thereafter.
Very true. Amy Dacey and Josh McCoon, thank you both for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From mic drop moments to gargantuan gaffes, American presidential debates have left us with some unforgettable snippets down the years. Toe-curling missteps and outrageous put-downs delivered with comic timing are part of the appeal of the occasion. There are few people on the planet who know more about the history of presidential debates than my next guest. Dr. Mitchell S. McKinney is Professor of Communication at the University of Akron and Dean of the Buchtel College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. McKinney, great to have you on the show. Now, I've just got to start by asking you, why do presidential debates matter? Do they actually change people's minds?
Riz, very good to be with you. And what we have found over the last several decades, actually, since we began presidential debates as a part of our general election campaigns here in the U.S. in 1960, that debates, by and large, do not change a lot of minds. However, in those few elections we've seen where we've featured televised presidential debates, where it is a close race leading into the election, and then also another feature, if there are one or more candidates relatively unknown or new to the national scene. Now, we see both of those conditions. I mean, the polling still suggests here this is going to be an election likely decided in the margins, 1-2 points. I think some of the latest polling coming out of the weekend showed nationally a 1-point race in the battleground states, several of the battleground states tied. And then in this debate, Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president, really, this debate likely will draw 50-60 million viewers who some of them trying to understand, do they feel comfortable with her? What is she all about? Certainly, Donald Trump is well known, but so those conditions are at play. A close race, a candidate to, in some ways, coming out to introduce herself to this large audience. And so this could be a very consequential debate in the outcome of this election.
So was there an actual turning point? I mean, when and why did debates become an essential part of the race to the White House?
Well, certainly we began in 1960, and that debate, again, and that series of debates, again, a very close election and relatively unknown youthful John Kennedy, contrasting with Vice President Nixon. And so our analysis showed that was a consequential debate in the outcome of the 1960 series of debates in the 1960 election. We then resumed debates in 1976, and they have remained a feature of our electoral process. In terms of a turning point, again, the opportunity for these debates to have a significant impact. We might talk about what happened a couple of months ago on the debate stage with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Certainly that proved significant in this election. And I would, Riz, point out, it is the only time when our presidential contenders, major party candidates, meet face to face in the long campaigns that we have. This will be true on the debate stage with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. They've never met each other before. We're watching to see, how do they interact with each other? How do they respond to one another? And that's important in terms of our assessment, really, of their leadership, their character, of the kind of leader that they would be. So for a number of reasons, we've seen that these debates really have become a significant part of our general election process.
I will come back round to the Joe Biden-Donald Trump debate, but I want to just look at it a little historically and ask, is it true that during the early debates, radio listeners sometimes had a different impression to TV viewers of the candidates?
Well, certainly in 1960, the reach of television, the saturation of television had not reached its point yet. Now, that debate in 1960, as these presidential debates continue to draw the largest viewing audience of any campaign event, whether it's their convention addresses or any of the stump speeches or rallies that the candidates will hold, we've seen 70, 80 million people assemble, U.S. viewers, voters assemble to watch these debates. And certainly in 1960, a large viewing audience, and then also a number of voters, of citizens who were listening radio. Some of that early analysis showed that, again, the visual impact of debates, and I call it the performative nature of debates, where we see the candidates on stage performing their audition as president, if you will. Now, in 1960, some analysis showed that those who were listening to the debate, not watching Richard Nixon and his performance, thought that he had won. Yet John Kennedy, those who watched the debate, and the more youthful John Kennedy and his debate style, his abilities in those debates, rendered him the winner of the debate. And I think that points to the power, the impact of television, again, of the visual, of the performative nature that we see that the candidates must display on the debate stage.
And of course, there was that issue of Richard Nixon having perspiration on his face, which I think made him look nervous.
Exactly. And again, those optics, and certainly, oftentimes, those become the moments that get replayed over and over and over. Those moments of how a candidate will laugh, will wince, will glare at their opponent, will respond. Again, that is what the debate moments bring to us in terms of our assessment of the candidate's abilities to perform their role as president.
Would you say that different rules produce different outcomes, whether you have an audience, a microphone on or muted, and so on?
Certainly. We've seen various tweaks to what we may call the format changes, the ability for journalists to ask follow-up questions. Oftentimes, those types of follow-ups reveal that candidates perhaps are not in command of facts and figures, or they're contradictory on their positions. The features such as mics on or off. Now, we went to the turning off of our candidate mics 4 years ago in the 2020 round of presidential debates, when particularly Donald Trump, in his first debate with Joe Biden, simply ignored the time rules. And also when the opponent had their opportunity, his opponent, Joe Biden, had his opportunity to speak. Donald Trump's strategy in that debate was to command the time, to dominate, to talk over, to interrupt. In some ways, I think a strategy to try to throw Joe Biden off, to try to befuddle Biden, to illustrate that Trump was more dominant, could control. And so the debate commission decided that, well, going forward, we will turn the mics off when it is not your time to speak, so you will not abuse the rules. Some have suggested, well, that may work against Kamala Harris, because if you keep Trump's mic on and Trump performs the way Trump usually performs, well, he may come across as the petulant bully, the constant interrupter. But if you turn his mic off, you control him, as did happen in his first debate a couple of months ago with Joe Biden. He appears more staid, some suggest presidential. And so that feature, that format feature of the debate certainly has gotten caught up in the strategy of who does it favor? And it is ironic that we came to the turning off of the mics because of Donald Trump, and now it is seen as helping Donald Trump and potentially not helping his opponent, Kamala Harris.
So the irony is that actually, as you indicate, his behavior was totally different in his last debate with Joe Biden. And if anything, he looked presidential, and he almost left Joe Biden to kind of dig his own grave, it seemed.
Exactly. Donald Trump did not engage in the domination, the constant interruptions, the asides, the taunts. And it was Joe Biden's performance in that debate that for many demonstrated that he was not up for re-election. He was not simply did not perform in a manner that suggested that he should or could continue as president. Of course, then in the several days, a few weeks that unfolded after that debate, with pressure from largely the Democratic operatives, the Democratic Party supporters, even supporters of Joe Biden, persuading him to step aside. So in that regard, I think we've pointed to a few debates in the history. I've mentioned the 1960, particularly the first Kennedy-Nixon debate, where John Kennedy really outperformed Richard Nixon. It is likely that we will point to that presidential debate that happened in late June as very consequential in the influence, perhaps the outcome of this election. We saw Donald Trump's unhappiness, surprise even, when what he predicted came about, that Joe Biden would not be able to stand 90 minutes and debate him, go toe-to-toe, and that happened. Joe Biden stepped aside. We have now a new Democratic nominee in this race, and it seemed to upset Donald Trump that he now has a new opponent. But it all came about because of really that early debate that Trump himself was pushing.
Well, Dr. McKinney, it's great to have the chance to pick your brains on the experience you've had. So I've got to ask you to wrap up. There have been a number of standout moments which can continue to entertain viewers from past presidential and vice presidential debates. Take me through some of your favorites.
Well, you know, I mentioned 1960 debates. We could go to 76, and I also mentioned a format feature of follow-up. When the incumbent president, Gerald Ford, indicated that there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and countries that he had visited. It was in the follow-up that the journalist pressed him, "Now, are you saying this?" And he doubled down. That went on, that flub, that lack of knowledge went on to hurt Gerald Ford. But it's not just those consequential moments. It's also even Ronald Reagan. There was an age issue with Ronald Reagan in his reelection in 1984, and he deftly handled a question regarding his age with humor. And so there's a moment. We could go through the decades and pick out a number of moments in these debates.
Well, Dr. Mitchell McKinney, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Great to have your experience on this.
Very good to be with you.
I leave you with one final thought. Before the cameras rolled last night in Philadelphia, the most watched presidential debate in history took place between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in September 2016. That drew an estimated TV audience of 84 million. In fact, Donald Trump was involved in 3 of the 4 highest audiences in election debate history. His first battle with Joe Biden in 2020 and his second Clinton debate ranked number 3 and 4. Only the combined efforts of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in 1980 could keep Mr. Trump from a clean sweep of the top 3 before last night. As for the debate which brought us to this moment, President Biden's disastrous performance against Donald Trump in June, A mere 51 million viewers regarded the matchup as a must-see moment, and yet it proved to be one of the most pivotal events in the current campaign, at least so far. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.